So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of seminars we are hosting with our friends at Charlotte Street Partners in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow later this year. The subject for today's discussion is financing the transition to net zero. My name is Nick Scott, and I am the managing partner of Brodies. We count amongst our clients those who are producers of energy, those who are consuming it, those assessing the climate impact of the supply chains and their own operations, and those tasked with regulating and setting policy around this arena. And of course, as we'll hear this morning, we also help clients who are involved in providing finance to all of those organizations. So we have clients at all points in the energy transition, and like our clients, we are assessing our own impact, whilst we assist our clients as they take the steps which they need to take to play their own part in the world's transition to net zero. So our series of events look at the transition from a range of perspectives. Today's looks first off at those who provide capital and finance the world's businesses. And with the benefit of our two guests this morning, I hope we can share some insights into their own approach to their operations, how they see their own purpose in this area, and how that purpose guides the decisions they make about the businesses which they look to support, and indeed why. So I'm delighted to say that I'm joined this morning by two very distinguished guests, each able to provide us with insights on all of those issues. So first, we're joined by Alison Rose, the Chief Exec of NatWest, an organisation which has been very clear about its own commitments in this area. And the Chief Exec also, who immediately upon her appointment was very clear that NatWest was a purpose-led organisation, and one of its core purposes was to help the world's transition. And we're also joined by Andrew Cave, Head of Governance and Sustainability at Baillie Gifford, a role he has held since 2015. Through that role, Andrew is a regular contributor to the discussion about climate change and indeed the financial sector's adjusting role in relation to it. And it will be clear from the things that he has to say this morning that it is a subject about which he is passionate. So good morning to both of you.
Morning.
So I thought first we might just kick off by getting our terms of reference right. I mean, if we're going to talk about the role of the finance sector in the transition to net zero, then of course the first thing we maybe should talk about is what actually is involved in that transition, both from an economic, technological and a societal perspective. Andrew, I know you've said a lot about this in the past. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, I think that there's a lot of terminology around just now. Everyone's become kind of overnight experts in this sort of subject, and we're very quickly moved on from sort of carbon footprinting, which was sort of a fairly new concept about 10 years ago, to thinking about Paris alignment in our businesses, and then net zero has now sort of emerged as the sort of lead concept. And net zero encapsulates this idea of getting our overall societal emissions to zero at some point. And that doesn't mean we won't emit carbon, but it will be balancing and offsetting technologies which take that additional carbon out of the system so that you end up with no net zero emissions into the atmosphere. So that's the goal. Key agreement is the Paris Agreement of 2015, which set the framework for this, and it gives us the sort of the goalpost, so to speak. So the Paris Agreement has a commitment of limiting global warming to 2 degrees centigrade, with a stretch target of 1.5 degrees if we can really get ourselves organized and sort of motor on. So that's why you often hear the two different sort of target reference points. So there's lots of activity gearing towards that. This year's COP26 is a sort of super COP in many ways, because there wasn't one last year. So it's a sort of double impact COP. But also, I think there's growing excitement that it will be the most important COP since the Paris Agreement. So the COP is the technical name for the United Nations organized meeting of governments to discuss climate change and climate change targets. So COP26 is the 26th meeting of these governments. So that's hence the terminology. And it happens to be meeting in Glasgow. So this is a really significant event for Scotland and the UK, and lots of interest in it. And what we hope will happen at COP26 is we'll get a lot more detail from countries in terms of how we will get to the Paris Agreement targets. So the essential milestones is what needs to happen next, and to turn some of the country level commitments on net zero into the hard and binding international targets. So that's the framework. I'm now behind that jargon. There's a lot to be figured out, and Alison knows very well from speaking to corporate clients. We can have a high level goal of getting to net zero, but the technology to get us there and the societal and economic changes to get us there are huge. This is the biggest shift in our entire economic system since really the Industrial Revolution. So I'll sort of pause there and hand back to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. And Alison, I don't know if you wanted to say anything particular on that subject there. I certainly wanted to touch first on our own individual organisations and contributions, but was there anything you'd like to add first?
No, I mean, I think Andrew sort of gave a great summary of the challenge and the opportunity, and I think the key element of the debate now has to move into how we finance and how we fund and how we affect the transition, to make sure that we don't create, unnecessary dislocation. Not all of the solutions of the new technology are there yet. Not everybody or every country is starting from the same position. So it is going to require an expectations, of Paris, and obviously now COP26 are high. But what is clear is you're going to need, very significant collaboration across, regulatory, finance ministers, countries, etc., in order to be able to solve this. This is a global problem that no one individual, any individual country or business is going to be able to solve on their own. So I think the key now is the transition and how we do it. I think the case is well made and is clear, and the imperative is critical. I think the how is now what we need to get on with.
Indeed, so thank you very much. And indeed, you've mentioned there quite a few things that I'd like to get onto in later in the hour. So I guess, well, let's talk about supporting the transition then. And Alison, I guess that in your context is customers. Andrew, for you, it's the businesses you invest in. And Alison, again, I know it's a bit something about which you said a fair bit in the past, that the practical help for customers. So do you want to kick us off just by talking about a few things that NatWest have been doing to support your own customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think certainly the position I take, and I've been very clear on, is as we're one of the leading lenders to businesses across the whole of the UK, and so we have to play our part in helping customers. It's not something that's going to be solved on its own. So, and I think we have to move very quickly from the theoretical to the practical steps to make sure that we don't create dislocation in either communities or countries or individuals to do that. So we've been very much focused on, I guess my approach from a NatWest perspective has been sort of three areas. Getting our own shop in order. I think that's a really important thing as a large corporate. So we're already net zero and we're looking to become net positive. I think secondly, ending the most harmful activities. So we have been reducing our exposure to oil and gas, but most importantly, we've been working with oil and gas providers to work with them that they have a credible transition plan by the end of this year, that they can get to Paris aligned. So I think that is important. And then phasing out coal by 2030. And then we've been very clear we want to halve the impact of climate emissions from our financing by 2030. So really putting a very clear stake in the ground of what we will do. And then thirdly, financing the transition. I think there's a huge opportunity here, which sometimes gets forgotten in terms of investing in new technologies, renewable energies. We're one of the leading lenders on that. I set a target to have 20 billion of investment by the end of next year. We're already at 12 this year, 12 billion. So we'll go harder on that. But I think most importantly, helping people make that transition. If you're, in the nicest possible way, a large corporate, you have the resources and the capabilities to be able to bring in legal teams and treasury teams and measure your emissions and so on and so forth. If you're an SME, it's much tougher. You don't have those resources. And we know from our research, around 88% of SMEs are saying we want to have a sustainable agenda. We want to reduce our emissions. We just don't know how to. And we don't have the tools and support to do that. So for us, it's about putting practical help in place, whether it's for SMEs, we've got a partnership with Microsoft to develop tools to help them measure the financing with the renewable energy side. For consumers, launching green mortgages to help people who are able to, cheaper pricing for green mortgages to create a little bit more of the incentives, and partnerships with companies like Octopus Energy to encourage move to electric cars, and then a Kogo app which we give to our customers to help them measure their emissions. So we're very focused on those three elements, but practical steps to help people and fund the transition, as well as advocating more broadly. We're part of GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Initiative for Net Zero. We're a member of the Net Zero Alliance, the Financial Services Task Force, to make sure that we can sort of help rally everyone to put practical steps in place. So that's kind of a high level sort of some of the things that we're doing.
Very good, and quite a bit of that I'd like to get into again if time allows. So, so Andrew, I guess turning to you. I mean, you invest globally, and the funds you're invested in are right across all sorts of sectors. I mean, is it worth sharing some of the examples of the way you're supporting businesses that your funds are invested in?
Well, sure, Nick. Well, first of all, like Alison, we've clearly looked at our own footprint and operations, and we've had quite stretching targets in place for things like business travel for some time, actually predating COVID. So we've sort of smashed our business travel reduction targets next pandemic, and hopefully we can sustain some of that as we move to more and more client servicing by Zoom, for example. I think what our clients have found is they quite like being serviced by Zoom. So I think there's a very decent chance that we can massively reduce our business travel footprint hereafter. And we're also moving office, so we're in the fortunate position of being able to specify into the build for our new Haymarket head office a number of environmental features. So that should put us in quite good shape in that sense. But clearly the real action for us is about our investments and the clients we have too, and our ability to help those clients meet their own net zero commitments. So we have a number of very progressive funds invested in us, like Brunel Pension Fund and CalSTRS and CalPERS, New York City, APG in the Netherlands, all of whom are real leaders in terms of setting very clear climate goals for asset owner institutions, and they're being driven by their members in turn. So there is a bit of a flywheel of activity. From our side, we're coming at this in a multifaceted way. We have a large ESG team who have quite a lot of climate expertise in that team. We have 24 people working in the space, 2 or 3 carbon specialists, and that's really sort of to meet the need of both the clients, but also our investment floor, who are increasingly active in this area. So when we think about our holdings, there's a number of different ways into it. Most people immediately think of oil and gas, and they think of renewables, and think this is really just about a shift from oil and gas to renewables. And the point I sort of continually stress is it's actually about everything. The entire economic system will change as we set increasingly aggressive carbon targets. So to give an example of the order of change we need, it's something akin to the carbon reduction target we saw with the pandemic lockdown that we'll need to achieve year after year to get anywhere near meeting the Paris Agreement. So that this is a really fundamental shift, and it means pretty much every industry will change. So some of the things we do right now, where we have an economic system optimized for cost, will change when we optimize for a combination of carbon and cost. It will change global supply chains, and where it was at previous uneconomic to ship steel, to manufacture steel, say in the UK, and it was better to ship from China. Carbon pricing will change all that, and as carbon pricing comes into shipping as well, and that whole sector starts to sort of fully internalize the cost, the environmental cost of carbon, whole supply chains will shift. So it's about helping all of our holdings, but we've done a few things for our clients. We have a climate optimism fund now that clients can invest in if they want exposure to some of the sort of key transition companies that Alison mentioned. So the exciting, innovative companies like Tesla and others who are very much the core businesses in cleaner technologies. But we're also doing a lot for all of our funds. So we have a variant model for our Global Alpha product, for example, which is one of our biggest funds. So local authorities can now invest in Global Alpha Paris Aligned, which is a sort of sub-model which has some additional checks and balances to align with the Paris Agreement. And then I think the kind of really interesting space though is helping some of the big industrial companies change, so that there's already lots of attention on clean tech and startups, and that's great. But I think one of our biggest and most important roles as stewards of capital is to help the industrial economy transition. So taking mining, for example, a lot of ethical investment funds don't hold miners, but they really should, because coltan and cobalt and nickel will be absolutely key to the transition. So we need to help mining companies change their businesses too.
Indeed, and that's a big question, isn't it? That point about and Alison, you've already touched on funding for renewable tech and the new technologies that we need, and the discussion's already been had, hasn't it, about half the technologies that we need don't yet exist, and our focus, or people could obsess about that side of the transition, but of course it is the scale effect, isn't it, as well? How much improving the activities of the older established industries will have a material impact, as well as, so it's a combination of those two aspects, isn't it? And I guess Alison, you've touched on this again in previous discussions about your attitude to the older industries. Is it worth sharing with listeners just a bit on that?
Yeah, look, I think that it's really important. I mean, the point you made there, it's not, it's not old technology versus new technology. We've got to transition, and if I think of our customers and I sit with have sat with different groups and representatives of the oil and gas industry, and the investments that they're making in transition and cleaner energy and how they support and the supply chain. It's really important that we look at transition. As a bank or any finance partner, withdrawing finance would not solve the carbon problem. It wouldn't solve the climate problem. It would means that potentially that financing would shift into private sector or different areas, and we wouldn't be solving the problem. Actually, what we need to do is solve the transition, and that's going to happen over a number of years. We've got a lot of work to do. So I think transition is really critical, and it's going to need real alignment between public and private sector. A great example would be the housing sector in the UK. It is responsible for a huge number of carbon emissions. A lot of houses do not fall within the right EPC ratings in terms of sustainability. That means we're not suddenly going to withdraw financing from that, because you need investment, you need things to happen to help that transition, and if you manage that badly, you will create dislocation in communities in different areas. So I think being really thoughtful about working with industries to transition, financing that transition, investing in the new, and doing that in a thoughtful way is really critical, because otherwise the easy answer of just stop won't stop things, and it won't change the carbon problem or the 1.5 degrees target that we need to get. We need to work really carefully. So I think collaboration, really thoughtful transition, data is really critical, so we know where we should go, and what can be achieved and how it can be achieved. I think we've all got to start, but I think it is about the transition.
Yep. And
sorry, Nick, I was going to say one practical example of that is when you think about oil and gas firms, their core specialism is in moving natural resources through pipeline infrastructure. And if we think about the hydrogen economy, which is actually hugely exciting, the potential for hydrogen to become a sort of base fuel for domestic heating, for heavy transport, trains, then oil and gas firms could be very well placed to provide infrastructure for that transition. So I think we absolutely have to move away from sort of beating up fossil fuel companies and thinking about how we help them transition in a way that's sort of good for their business, but also good for everybody, because actually their core competence can really help us in the years ahead.
Indeed.
The other thing I would say as well is hydrogen is really exciting, but there's also waste and water in terms of what you can do in terms of creating energy from that as a different solution. I was talking with the CEO of Thames Water the other day, and projects where we can develop in that space as well maybe don't sound as exciting as hydrogen, but they're really practical and things that we can do today. So I think we need to be really thoughtful about that transition. But Andrew's right. The level of investment that oil and gas sectors are putting into how we transition, and also their knowledge, is absolutely critical in how we will achieve this.
Indeed, and we've watched and observed that from our own perspective with the clients that we're working with, and so they're both investing in new technologies. But the thing that we must remember, of course, is that they're tremendous generators of new technology themselves. That's what they're specialists at, and there's a tremendous resource. And we'll perhaps wrap up the session today near the end, looking at Scotland's position in this and the potential competitive opportunities we have, and the things or the skills that we've got to contribute to this. To the transition, and certainly the expertise and the hub of excellence that we've got in Scotland, a centre in the northeast, and the UKCS is clearly something that we can build upon. So we might come back onto that. I mean, Alison, you have just to finish on the oil and gas piece, you've obviously been clear that you will continue to support oil and gas companies, but there is a price to the ticket, isn't there? So Do you want to just share with us what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been clear we will support oil and gas customers. But we want to work with them to have a credible transition plan to align with Paris. So we're working with all of our customers on what those credible transition plans are. Those credible transition plans need to be in place by the end of this year. I think we're very well advanced on that in terms of measuring the emissions and then working together with them. We have said we will phase out coal by 2030, but I think it's important to work across the industry to make sure that we can, not only understand that transition, work with them, and also, as a finance provider, incentivize that transition as well. So we've been very clear that with the oil and gas sector, it's only 0.8% of our balance sheet, but providing there are credible transition plans, that's what we will do, and we'll work in partnership with our customers on that.
Thank you. And then we'll quickly come on to COP, but just one last thing on the kind of helping clients, customers, investee businesses. I mean, we talked about practical help quite a bit. One thing, a client said to us once, we as a business have one perspective or one lens on a problem or a challenge, whereas you, of course, interact with many clients, and it's the same in your businesses, customers, investee businesses. The sharing of insights, the harnessing of best practice. You've mentioned data already. Alison, I mean, is there something either of you wish to, is there experience you've got of sharing and taking best practice and helping other customers with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely something which is going to need to be as I describe it, as a collaborative sport in terms of resolving that. So a lot of the tools we're developing, so a great example is the partnership with Microsoft, where we're developing tools, particularly for SMEs, to allow them to measure their emissions and what tools they would need to help reduce their emissions in their own supply chain and their own businesses. And in that, we will be providing data and insight from across sector and across business. We work, for example, very closely with the agricultural sector. We're one of the largest lenders to ag, and we work really closely with the universities to help share best practice. And then obviously in terms of providing renewable financing, and our sector specialists, share all of that good insight with our customers. So as much as we can share, what looks good, what other people have done, and how that happens, that's absolutely what we should be doing. And part of our role in GFANZ, which is really critical around moving to net zero, is encouraging as many people to sign up to the net zero target, particularly SMEs, as we can. Mm-hmm. And I think with that really does become a way in which you can start sharing, best practice and tools and how-tos to help people on this journey, because some people are further ahead and some people haven't started yet. So, we take the view our onus is on helping everyone. Indeed.
Andrew, did you have anything you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, well, I think the point around data is absolutely fundamental here, in that we have an increasingly long list of well-intentioned companies wanting to do the right thing, but if the data isn't there to support their choices, there's actually the risk that we do some really unhelpful things in the years ahead with regards to the net carbon challenge. And I mean, I sometimes frame the data challenge out. You can probably tell from the map behind me, I'm a map geek. And I think where we are in ESG, more broadly, environmental social governance as a sort of discipline in asset management, is in the kind of really nascent stage where we know almost nothing. So I kind of use the analogy of the kind of early Renaissance maps, where they moved from medieval maps where the whole world was filled in because the map makers just made up the bits they didn't know. And then the kind of first Enlightenment maps, which had some tiny sections of coastline filled in because that's what they knew for sure. And even if it was maybe 10% of the globe, that's sort of where we are in ESG. We actually know very, very little about global supply chains. We know very little about the environmental impact of different industries, because capitalism is really complex. It wasn't set up to have an environmental footprint accounting of the entire value chain. It was optimized around cost and convenience and speed. So even basic commodities like agricultural feedstock, you take the chicken feed. A lot of the supply chain for that is quite complicated, and actually what you find is a lot of the common modern day feedstocks have a heavy element of soya in them, which is sort of Latin American soya, which is contributing hugely to deforestation, and there's no certification regime around that. So whilst European consumers might eat European certified fair trade soya, the feedstock is completely uncertified. So So actually, just mapping out that value chain is actually quite complicated, and that applies to almost every industry. If you take global fashion, the fashion industry is hugely inefficient from a carbon and environmental point of view. We do sort of pretty horrific things, and designers design clothes they think people might wear next year. We then make 20,000 units. They're then shipped across the world several times in the manufacturing process. They're moved into stores which are heated or cooled, and consumers go along and have a look to see if they might like those clothes, and some do, and take them home. A lot gets unsold, and then is either burnt or sort of recycled in a fairly inefficient way. So there's potential to take the whole fashion industry and make that probably 90 to 95% more carbon efficient by coming at that challenge differently with on-demand manufacturing, for example, virtual reality as a way of trying on clothing, for example, at home, and then if you like it, you can then push the button to have that made up to your exact size in sort of smart manufacturing technology, probably in this country and close to consumers for other reasons. So there's that's just one example of where, but that whole thing needs data. Data will drive that change.
Yeah.
To do this properly, we need a huge investment in data industry. So I think you hinted about Scotland's comparative advantage. I think there's a great opportunity for a whole range of startup businesses in the kind of environmental data space.
Indeed, and we'll come back to that. So we've done Renaissance maps to high fashion via chicken feed. So topics I didn't think I was going to be discussing this hour. Well, thank you for that. Let's take the point you were making a few minutes ago, Alison, about collaboration and go on to that in collaboration, partnership, and COP. And obviously, very pleasing to see NatWest is one of the principal partners for COP this year. Of course, COP is principally about extracting commitments from governments, from organizations, and from businesses, but it's also crucially about making that commitment that you've already hinted at, which is to work together and collaboration between organizations. And you've been clear in the past that this is beyond the wit of one particular business or one provider of finance or one country. I mean, do you want to just talk to us a bit about your own perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it, we're facing a global challenge, and what's really clear, and there were lots of commitments made at Paris that haven't yet been fulfilled, and we know we're at an urgent point. But for certainly some of the emerging markets and developing markets, they're starting at a different place, and there's going to need to be, I think the estimates are 100 billion of investment going into emerging markets to help them with their climate journey. So I think importantly, not everybody's starting from the same place, and we are going to need to look at how we look at making that transition globally. And it's great in the run up to COP. We have the US back at the table, and the commitments from China, as well as Europe and across the world. So those are really important, because we're not going to solve this on our own. I think secondly, it's also not going to be solved only by private finance. It's going to need public and private finance and regulatory and government intervention in order to help that. I think in order to meet this, policy is going to have to follow strategy on climate so that we can effect some of these changes, because otherwise you will get the dislocation that I've talked about, or the transition not being fair or just or in the right way. And then you've got trillions of pounds and dollars of money, which is really pointing at this problem, which is fantastic. The asset managers, and the insurers, the banks have all come together in different partnerships and made different commitments of financing the transition. We need the projects in order to support that, and we're going to need blended finance. So the World Bank, IMF, all of those different elements are going to need to come together. And to Andrew's point, the data, we really need to get common standards of data, so we know what we're measuring, so that we can really make the difference. So it is going to need huge collaboration and intervention. And if I think about, let's take it down from a macro to a micro, but if I think about residential housing stock, retrofitting and creating, energy efficient housing stock across the world. You have things pulling in different directions. If I think about the US, the banks have to fund community projects which are in housing, which are going to be inconsistent with the energy ambition. So, that needs to be aligned. Putting green mortgages in place is great. We've got a green mortgage. It's cheaper to take out a green mortgage, but that's not going to address the retrofit that needs to happen. And so there needs to be public funding and policy funding in order to support that. Energy suppliers, supply chain, house builders, lenders are all going to need to work the construction industry of getting carbon out of production of buildings and cement. These are things that are going to need to happen. So that makes it sound almost impossible, but it's not, because if you start in the right place and you measure and you make the transition and you make the commitments, I think that will happen. And again, I'll come back to the point I made at the sort of early on. I think what's really important is it doesn't end up becoming, if I, as a finance partner, the regulatory side needs to change to allow me to deploy capital in a way that doesn't get negative capital treatment. Otherwise it becomes a tax on the banks, which inevitably is going to cause a challenge. But if we can get regulatory compliance all lined up, then we can direct it that way, and getting it put in policy and committed means that we can put the support behind. So it is going to need collaboration, but I think going into COP, we're in a better place with the US and China at the table, with financial services task force, with the insurance sector, with the asset managers, trillions and trillions of pounds directed at this. I think we need to think about blended finance, public policy, sector approach, so we really start making a difference, and then really thinking in terms of transition. And I would say there's huge optimism here. There's a huge opportunity. We're going to create new jobs, new environments. It can be a regeneration. This often used phrase, build back better. I think that is a real opportunity for us to do that, and the urgency and the criticality of the problem, I think, is very clear. But I think we have to be policy shapers, and that's certainly the view that I take as a CEO of a large organization. My role is not only just to help my customers, but also try and help shape the policy that will enable this to happen as well. And that's why we're sort of addressing this very firmly as a strategic imperative, but also in our role at COP26, but also GFANs and in other groups.
We'll come on to that.
Optimism point. Sorry, I was just going to say that optimism point is absolutely key. I think, Nick, that I think to a lot of people, this is a very daunting area, and it feels like the transition is going to be very painful. But actually, there's lots of reasons why it might not be so. If we can get the right support for a just transition for the socioeconomic sectors which are most exposed to changing technologies and some additional pricing, if we can get support for that, actually, there's a huge amount to like. You take different sectors like healthcare. We have the potential to make healthcare much more efficient as we move from sort of scattergun, reactive healthcare after people have got sick, to sort of data-led, personalized healthcare using genetic information and sort of targeted fixes for individuals. So that that again, the healthcare sector could become 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% more efficient with a much better outcome for patients. So that's hugely exciting. And to Alison's point around thinking about where the change needs to happen. So cement is a great example where I often get asked by some young graduates where they should go and work if they're so passionate about climate change, and they want to go and work for us, either a startup, developing new technology, or they want to come into asset management and to work in an ESG team. But actually, if you're really committed, you should go and work for that CRH, the giant cement company, and it's the work in-house on helping companies like that transition, because that's a hugely important job, and an enormous career opportunity too over the kind of next couple of decades to help those big companies move.
So another surprise for this conversation then, a waving of a flag for people to apply for jobs in the construction and the cement industry. So and Alison there, a long shopping list for things to come out of COP that you're pushing for. I mean, Andrew, is there anything else and Alison's made the point about regulatory alignment, needing to align with the policy objectives. Anything else that the financial sector would need or would look for support from COP to help it play its part here?
I think the regulation is the most fundamental thing of all. The reason why there's excitement about a shift is because we've been getting the big economies coming out with net zero commitments. So when China made a net zero commitment, that was just a turning point. And the Biden administration has followed that up with some more aggressive targets for the US. So that's why COP26 might be the most important COP in a very long time, because you have that groundswell of support from the kind of big economies. The key though is regulatory certainty, because it just doesn't work to chop and change subsidy regimes, for example, over sort of short cycles. You have to set out a regulatory framework which will see us through 10, 20, 30 years of transition, and then try and stick to that as much as possible. So that would be my sort of plea to domestic governments as they come away from COP and try and build this into national plans, is to sort of think beyond parties and think beyond electoral cycles and think about what is the kind of greater good here in terms of regulatory certainty, because everything will fall apart with that. The money is there. Alison is right. There's a lot of finance ready to finance the new technologies and to help with transition, but that can't work without a sort of regulatory framework which is consistent and supportive.
Indeed. Okay, thank you. And I guess, Alison, just on this collaboration piece as well, you've already mentioned GFANZ and the Banking Alliance under Mark Carney's leadership, and some pretty clear and specific commitments, aren't they? Half emissions from lending activities by 2030 and eradicate them by 2050. I mean, what do you think are the biggest challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been very clear that those commitments are critical in order to make the shift. The biggest challenges are starting off getting the data. You need to know what your emissions are to start with, and so having common standards of data. We've already measured around 46% of our balance sheet of our key sectors. So that's the starting point. I think the biggest challenge is then how you transition them, and that's where you're going to need, the alignment. We're not going to be able to transition the housing sector in the UK on our own without intervention. So I think that's important. I think that the second biggest challenge is the one I mentioned around, for businesses, for SMEs, giving them the tools and the help and support to make the transition. And the insight to do that, and certainly visibility through the supply chain. I think that's absolutely critical. And there are going to be some tough choices as you navigate through that, but there's no lack of ambition to do it. I think the targets are very clear. I think the how and getting the policy and the regulation to catch up really quickly once we've got common standards of data is going to be vital in order to turn theory into action, and that's what we need to get to. We need to get into action very quickly. I think the commitment to net zero, I would encourage as many people as possible to sign up to net zero. I think once you've done that, you can get on the path of how you're going to do that, and that's when we can start bringing best practice and scale and scope into that. So I think data, critical, common standards, and then regulation and policy working together in order to affect the change.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we'll come on to hand in glove with data, of course, is how you might value business and assess their climate, the risk or otherwise for their business from their climate activities. And we might come on to that. I guess one thing I want to come on to now is purpose. Question each organization ask itself, and as I said earlier, Alison, something we're very clear as soon as you were appointed as chief executive to make that clear that it was NatWest, was a purpose-led organization. I mean, I guess the question is this carrot or stick? We've talked a lot about supporting the transition, supporting customers and the investee businesses, but I guess to be more specific, is the role of finance here to support businesses on that transition or to drive it? And is there a view there? I mean, I guess, Alison, over to you first. That purpose to support the world's transition, just talk to us about how that influences your attitude and assessment of decisions you're making.
Yeah, I mean, look, I put climate very firmly as one of our key strategic priorities. I think we have, to be a purpose-led organization, and our purpose is very clear. We're there to sort of champion potential of families and businesses and people that we support, and to build a long-term sustainable business that creates value for not just shareholders but customers and communities. And I'm, at the fundamental heart of that is if we if our customers succeed, we will succeed, our shareholders will succeed. So that is the equation in terms of what we're doing. I think our role as a finance provider in this key area of focus, and we have three that we focus on, but climate a core one, is to help drive and support the transition. I think there are elements of carrot in there, but I think also elements of key focus to support our customers make that transition. And I do come back to that represents an enormous opportunity for communities and businesses as well. And it is becoming, as you look forward, this is going to become policy. It is going to become more critical. And I think it's vital we help people on the transition so that they can build sustainable businesses, that their homes are sustainable, that we're protecting communities and creating opportunities for investment in jobs. So, finance provides liquidity for the economy, and that's what our role is. And to make that economy sustainable, we need to be supporting that transition. So, in some of the things that we've been doing, for example, our issuing of green bonds, there is a carrot in there because we can get cheaper pricing and we can access broader funds, on our own funding social housing bonds. There is no shortage of liquidity for those. They're oversubscribed, which means we can reinvest back into housing. So we can build incentives into our financing packages. Green mortgages are cheaper to help people benefit from making these decisions rather than carrying solely the burden of doing it themselves. But equally, we have to move at pace. It can't be that we offer that help and it's not taken either, because we do have to solve this issue. This is not a problem that's going to go away, and therefore that's our role in it.
Thank you. And Andrew, I guess reflecting that, you in the selection of the business you invest in, talk to us about the climate lens which your funds and your colleagues in the business are making, and the criteria you're applying.
Yeah, your question around do we lead or support? That's a really important one, I think, for the finance community, and we're all wrestling with that. And it's what I kind of frame as the kind of agent or actor conundrum. Are we an agent of other people's money, or are we an actor with more ability to lead and influence development in a broad way? I think it's probably as a evolution in asset management, but where I think if you'd asked people 5 years ago, we would have all said agent, and that it's other people's money, and it's not for us to sort of direct that in socially positive ways. I think that has rapidly moved on. I think the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then regulation in a number of markets has sort of really, shaken the asset management sector out of that state of mind. And I think we can actually do quite a lot. And partly what we do is offer choice. I mentioned some of our newer products. So we offer the ability for clients to move their money into Paris-aligned funds or climate-specific thematic funds. And I think that's probably the most useful thing we can do. For our holdings, I think we do try and offer a better quality of ownership. We try and have hands-on engagement meetings with all key holdings who have significant contribution to play in the sector, and help them improve, and just make sure they know that we're a supportive long-term holder who would like them to invest in this change, because we think that's ultimately good for their business. So I think there's quite a lot of some moving parts. But I think that kind of role of finance, ultimately the role of finance in the financial services sector is to put spare capital to work in the economy. That's what we do. And that's Alison's business or our business. We're an intermediary, and our core competence is deploying that capital in a useful way. And if that definition has to tweak to involve, deploying capital in a socially, environmentally sustainable way, so be it. I think that's a very good purpose for finance companies, and might see a new wave of people coming into finance with more of a kind of mission-led approach to their career.
Yeah, I remember listening to something you'd said previously about lawyers were very good at giving lists of things you can't do, but the question is whether or not actually the purpose is to define the things you should be doing, which is a good one. And you said something there, which is intriguing, that encouraging businesses to invest, because in the long term that's of interest. And I guess a question to both of you, Alison, you have customers, but you also have shareholders, and Andrew, you have, as you mentioned, you have your investors. That trade-off, or how one has the conversation with shareholders about where is the trade-off between doing activities which are supporting a transition but also maximizing shareholder return, and where is there a contradiction? Where's the overlap? Is one actually ultimately support the other? Alison, maybe you first, a perspective on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, for my shareholders, you want to create long-term sustainable returns, and I think risk present, and you always have the short-term versus the long-term challenge, which is a natural sort of conflict that occasionally happens. But I think if you're going to build long-term sustainable value, then we know the sort of climate challenge presents a significant risk in outlook, and therefore to address that now, to fund the transition, the financial opportunity from the transition is very significant. That you're building, more sustainable earnings, better management of risk, and greater value for long-term holders. So I think that is, the definition of, a purpose-led strategy in terms of thinking long-term. And, as Andrew sort of mentioned, asset managers and investors are very focused on the ESG agenda, because they are looking at, the value of their investments and the long-term value, and the risk and the opportunity that climate presents in terms of businesses. And I think significantly more see the opportunity than the other. So, I think, if you're looking for long-term holders, and income holders, then those are the shareholders that this will very much appeal to.
Andrew, a reflection from you?
Yeah, so I think, timeframes are key, and this is where, when you think about asset managers and investors, I think the different styles of investment come in. That this now sounds like a house plug for an investor, which is very long-term and very active in our style. But we do think this is a huge tailwind for the active management sector, because responsible investing and climate transition investing, it needs a lot of data, a lot of insight, and it needs constant dynamic choices. So you have to continually update the thesis on these companies, based on emerging data and engagement with management. So it lends itself very well to active management. So we're quite excited about that, and I think our clients should recognise that. And the big shift here is this isn't really just about us. We are being driven hard by our clients. Mm-hmm. It's really important to emphasise how progressive some of the big pension funds are now, who have been pioneers in terms of setting binding commitments to asset managers to address these issues. And so they're actually the top of the value chain, by the way. And when I say pension funds, it's ordinary people. That's the irony here. It's actually it's ordinary hardworking people, to use a politician's phrase, who have the power here, because their pension schemes are the big asset owners that are investing for some 10, 20, 30 years into our listed corporations, and have a huge say actually in terms of how this progresses. So if there's one thing you want to do to turbocharge your finances and attune them towards transition, it's get in touch with people who run your pension fund and make it clear this is really important to you, and you would like to see an active allocation towards climate transition in your portfolios, because that will drive enormous amounts of change right through the whole system.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, the other thing I would add is, and I think just building on Andrew's point, this is not something where you're pushing on a door that's closed. We can see our customers are demanding this. The survey we did with our SMEs, 88% saying they want sustainability to be part of their business choices. They just don't know how to go about it or get the resources. If I think about my colleagues, they've set up their own sustainability network, employee-led network, because it's really critical to them. We've just put 1,500 colleagues through sort of climate change and sustainability programs at Edinburgh University and at the Cambridge Institute. There is, a real demand from, colleagues and customers about making smart choices, and therefore helping them and giving the information in their hands to do that, I think is something that is increasingly being demanded.
Indeed,
yeah, the whole point about 20 years ago, the whole environmental business debate was about sort of corporations versus the people. Mm-hmm. And that is really becoming outdated as a sort of model. And NGOs recognize that, by the way. They're kind of increasingly privately collaborating with big businesses, because they're key to the transition. So much of the global economic value chain is driven by corporations, and multinationals that we don't have time to build a different economic system. So, I love social enterprises and community-owned businesses, but they will never scale up, quickly enough to deliver the kind of core services we all want as part of a transition. And they won't give up, like, heat, mobility, cooling. They just can't scale up to meet that challenge. But BASF and Siemens and Rolls-Royce, these companies can, and that's why we should all get in behind them and sort of see the corporation as actually the perfect vehicle to achieve societal goals, because it's widely owned, it's got a public charter, there's a sort of democratic underpin to the corporation, and there's a longevity to it as well because of the ultimate long-term business vehicles which succeed family generations and so on, and have a potentially infinite time scale. So corporations really should be part of the answer, and I think people are beginning to see that.
And it is a fascinating subject, isn't it? Because the voice of colleagues within organisations. I mean, both of you, Alison, a fundamentally different scale of business from Andrew's, but even at our level as well, 750 colleagues. That is one of the strongest voices in our organisation. Are we living the values as an organisation, but are we involved in the activities, and are we managing our business in a way which aligns with their ambitions and their aspirations for the future? And so that's a whole fascinating separate discussion. And Alison, you mentioned earlier in the conversation the concept of dislocation or a just transition, and a lot has been said in that environment. It's subject to some of the questions that have come through. Also in the discussion, there's one question which is about that trade-off. Are we focused on net zero? Or are we also focused clearly on trying to have a just transition, or one that balances social needs? And I guess one of the other questions that's come through during the session is, let's not just look at this clearly in a Northern European or a Western world perspective. This is a global thing, and clearly the dislocation or the impacts of the transition are going to be different according to the economies and how far advanced or otherwise they may be. I mean, do you want to just say something on that first, Alison?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I think at the heart of it is we've got to make sure that the transition happens, and fundamentally we're trying to solve to net zero, because I think that's a really important target to get to, because and I think that the two can run together. I think to get to net zero, we have to have that target, we have to have that commitment, and more companies that join up to that, and small businesses, I think is really critical, because that is the target. But as I said, we've got to take carbon out of the economy, or offset the carbon, rather than shift it from one area to another, which is the fundamental part of transition, and that's why I'm very firm on that position of you shouldn't be withdrawing financing from industries that are heavy carbon users. You should be working with those industries to help them transition, with the aim to getting to net zero. I think the risk and why a just transition is what I talk about as well, is if you went the very simple route of saying, let's just stop my three-prong approach, as I described it, of get your own house in order, end harmful, and transition. If you just did end harmful, you wouldn't be creating a just transition, because you would inevitably create dislocation in communities, those who can't afford to transition, those who don't have the tools or expertise. And then obviously the emerging markets and developing nations are starting from a different position, and it's not appropriate to hold them to the same standards of developed markets. So we actually have to put significant funding to help invest in that transition. So I think net zero is absolutely the right thing to do, because unless we have that, just moving money around the globe is not going to solve the problem. So net zero is the right thing, but you can achieve a just transition by doing that, because that's where the investment comes, that's where the transition comes, to make sure that we understand where people are starting from, so that we can help transition. And that's where I think it is incumbent on finance providers like myself and other banks, the insurance sector, all of the different providers and participants in this, government regulation, to make sure that we use it as an opportunity to create jobs, to create new investment, to create ways of doing that. And in some ways, what we've gone through over the last year has proven you don't need to live in one particular place to do a particular job. You can do things in a much more flexible way, and I think that offers different opportunities as well to invest in different communities that are going to help be part of this transition.
Thank you, and I'm conscious of time now, but I did say that we would finish by taking this back to Scotland, where of course COP is coming in the coming months. So I guess that question about what has Scotland got that it can add to this discussion, where are our competitive advantages, where to turn this into, as you both have, an opportunity discussion. Where just talk to us about that. So Andrew, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just linking the last question to that one. I mean, the just transition is really about maintaining the political will for change. So without a just transition, there will not be the political will to drive through these changes, because it's we have to do this in a way which is good for everybody in a sort of net way. So people want affordable heating, affordable cooling, mobility, entertainment, leisure services. How we get there, there's huge amounts of options, but they have to continue to be affordable. People will not put up with very significant changes to their lifestyle in a sort of negative sense, and maintain that political support. Scotland's role is key because it's one of the questions we're asked about. Well, it's all very well what happens in Europe, but what about developing world? It's fundamentally important what happens there. The kind of net zero transition will be won or lost in India and China. It won't be Scotland. Scotland is unfortunately somewhat irrelevant. It's got the size, population terms, but the size of this regional city in China. But it has a hugely important role in terms of influence and the ability to lead a transition and sort of show what a just transition looks like by modeling some of the economic and social changes which we would like others then to get behind. And it also has a huge natural capital advantage in terms of renewable energy, but also the kind of economic infrastructure and heritage of the oil and gas sector. Aberdeen should turn into the world's leading centre for offshore renewables over the next 20 years if we get our policy right. But what a great transition that would be. And then those technologies can be exported around the world. That IP can go around the world. So I wrote a sort of slightly cheesy piece for the Scotsman called Transition Glen, but it was really framing that opportunity for Scotland to be a sort of transition leader and then to do very well economically out of that as well. So yeah, I think exciting times for Scotland.
And Alison?
Yeah, look, I think it's a hugely exciting time for Scotland. The eyes of the world are going to be on COP26 in Glasgow. So what better time is there to demonstrate sort of leadership from that perspective? And as Andrew said, the real opportunity to transition, into a new low carbon economy and demonstrate that and lead from that perspective. I was just reflecting. I've got 1,000 colleagues of mine who've just gone through the training at Edinburgh University Centre for business, climate change and sustainability. Great thought leadership and great examples of taking that learnings and applying it more broadly as well. So look, I think eyes of the world are going to be on COP26. I think this is one of the most important events and policies that have come out of there, and it's happening in Scotland. And when I spend time with leaders from the oil and gas industry, they're really, ahead of the game in terms of thinking about transition and, what happens, over the next 10, 15, 20 years and the dependency on the supply chain and the innovation that happens there. So I think real opportunity to showcase that entrepreneurial and leadership on climate.
Thank you very much. That's a perfect way to end the discussion. So we've only just scratched the surface in the time available on a whole range of subjects. But thank you very much to the two of you for your insights and for your thoughts, Alison and Andrew. And thank you for your time. Thank you also to those who are listening. And just for those who are listening, a heads up for the next instalment of this series with Charlotte Street Partners. The next one is on the 22nd of June, 11 o'clock again, this time chaired by Andrew Wilson of Charlotte Street Partners with our own Claire Munro. And that will be looking at the heritage oil and gas companies and their role in the transition. But for now, my thanks to both our speakers, and thank you to our listeners for joining today. And I shall wish you a good day. Thank you very much.